when this man appeared at my door asking, "Can I feed someone in exchange for bread?" I saw something strange about his hands, something that didn't match his dirty clothes or his trembling voice. Rain falls in silver threads against the red brick wall. Arthur Wright shrinks under the eaves. His hands, covered in scars only chefs understand, shaking not from cold, but withdrawal. 3 days without alcohol, 3 eternities. He watches the kitchens flow through the screen door, the ballet of cooking, knives singing against boards, the hiss of pans, the ancestral rhythm of service. His hands twitch with phantom memory. He pushes the door. The noise stops. 7 pairs of eyes pierce the intruder. Arthur feels the weight of each gaze like a punch to the gut. He walks toward Eleanor Vance, back turned to him, commanding the flames like a maestro. She turns, and he sees recognition ignite in her eyes before the curtain of professionalism falls. "Need something?" Her voice is an icy blade. Arthur swallows dry. His next words come out like a stolen whisper. "Can I feed someone in exchange for a piece of bread?" Cutting laughter echoes through the kitchen, and in turn shakes his head with disdain. But Eleanor doesn't laugh. She watches his hands, how the fingers curve slightly, as if still holding an imaginary knife. 7 years ago, a gala dinner, Arthur at his peak, 3 shining stars gleaming on his chest. Eleanor, young sous chef, watching in awe as his hands performed impossible movements with vegetables and proteins. The same hands now dirty from the gutter, trembling, begging for crumbs. Eleanor hands him a bowl of soup. "Wash the stack of pots in the back, then you eat." Arthur doesn't look at the food. He looks at the pots, dirty, stacked like a tower of challenge. His eyes gleam with something that isn't physical hunger. He approaches the sink. The pots are in chaos, burnt residues, dried sauces, the silent testimony of a busy night. His hands, trembling moments before, now stabilize upon touching the first pot. He turns it, studying the burn patterns like an archaeologist deciphering hieroglyphs. Fire too high on the reduction, he murmurs almost inaudibly, and someone forgot to deglaze. The intern who laughed earlier now watches, confused, because the homeless man speaks like a chef. Arthur takes the sponge not as a condemned man, but as a surgeon. Every movement is economical, precise. He isn't washing pots, he's reading the history of every failed dish. 2 hours later, the stack of pots shines like new armor. Arthur approaches Eleanor, who's tasting a sauce with a critical expression. "It's done," he says. She points to the forgotten soup bowl. "Your food." He sits on the milk crate in the back. The bread is hard, the soup lukewarm. He dips the bread and brings it to his mouth, and then it happens. His eyes close. A tremor runs through his body, not of pleasure, of recognition. "Caramelized onion with marsala wine," he whispers, a touch of nutmeg at the end. "And you corrected the acidity with green apple." Eleanor freezes. Her spoon falls on the counter with a metallic clang. No one in the current kitchen would know that. It was her secret, the signature she learned from. Their eyes meet through the kitchen steam haze. The past hits squarely between them. "Who are you?" Eleanor's question is a blade without edge, but the intention is deadly. Arthur stands. His height, once curved by shame, now fills the space. He doesn't answer. Instead, he walks to the counter where a chef's knife rests. Everyone stops. The intern reaches for the phone. Arthur picks up the knife, not as a weapon, as an extension of himself. His hand closes around the worn wooden handle. The fingers find their places like lovers reuniting after years. He takes a forgotten onion, and without looking, he executes a movement, a single fluid cut that transforms the vegetable into perfect, symmetrical, impossible cubes. The silence is so absolute you can hear the fat sizzling on the distant grill. He places the chopped onion before Eleanor. "Just a man who needs to feed someone," he says, "in exchange for bread." He turns and returns to the sink, to the next stack of dirty dishes. Eleanor looks at the onion cubes, each facet a mirror of her own confusion. Her hands tremble now. The rain had stopped, but the storm inside Eleanor had just begun. She watched Arthur from the pantry shadows, every movement he made at the sink echoing in her memory like distant drums. His fingers, still slender, still elegant even beneath the grime, moved with the economy of gesture that only decades before the stove teach. He scrubbed a copper pot like someone caressing a wounded animal, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. And then she remembered. September, 7 years ago, the dining room of Luminous, in Paris, where 3 golden suns shone above the entrance, her, just 26, finally securing a reservation after 6 months of waiting. The chef's table, single seat before the open kitchen where Arthur Wright, the British prodigy, worked his magic. He was in his 30s then, but moved with the gravity of a much older man. His eyes, the same ones now staring at dirty water, then sparkled with blue fire. Every dish that left his hands wasn't food. It was edible architecture, poetry in flavor form. "The béarnaise is too hot," he told a sous chef without even looking at the pan. "It's breaking the yolks." The voice, the same one that had whispered for bread today, then cut the air like a blade. The sous chef, a 50-year-old man, blushed like a scolded child. Eleanor had ordered the tasting menu, 9 courses that made her cry 3 times. On the 7th, a pheasant with truffles and something she never could identify, he appeared beside her. "You're a chef," he declared, "didn't ask." "Yes, a small bistro in Lyon." He took her spoon, tasted his own dish, and frowned. "It lacks acidity. Did you notice?" She nodded, stunned. "A raspberry vinegar perhaps?" "No." His eyes pierced hers. "The sourness of life itself. You cook like someone afraid of pain." That phrase had haunted her for years. Now, in her humble kitchen in Ohio, she watched the same man washing pots for food. What had happened? How did 3 suns go dark? Arthur finished the last pot and turned, surprised to find her standing 3 meters away. "Is there more?" His voice was hoarse from dehydration. She shook her head. "You know Luminous." It wasn't a question. He froze, his hands contracting involuntarily. The silence that followed was more eloquent than any confession. "I went there once," Eleanor continued, approaching. "The chef told me I cooked afraid of pain." His eyes closed. For a moment, she saw the man he'd been, the weight of unbearable genius on his shoulders. "He was an idiot," Arthur whispered. "Pain is the only seasoning that matters." He moved to pass her, but she blocked his path. "Why are you here, Arthur Wright?" For the first time, his eyes met hers directly, and in them she saw the abyss, not of arrogance, but of something much worse, absolute, complete, and total despair. "Because it's the only place left where I can smell food without wanting to die," he said, and the simplicity of the statement hit her like a punch. He walked out into the cold night, leaving her alone with the ghost of who he'd been and the mystery of who he'd become. In the sink, the pots shone like fallen stars, and in the air, the scent of her secret, caramelized onion with marsala, still hanging like a ghost between them. The memory hit Arthur like a physical blow as he walked through the icy rain back to his shelter, a storage room behind the old bakery that smelled of yeast and forgotten dreams. He could still feel the heat of that night, the flames licking the white, immaculate walls of his kitchen, the way the smoke tasted of failure. He hadn't meant to burn everything down, not literally, at least. 3 years earlier, the weight of the three sons had become unbearable. Every critic's praise felt like another chain, every perfect review, another brick in the prison of his own excellence. The world saw a culinary genius. He saw a fraud waiting to be exposed. The night it happened began like any other service at Luminous, 18 courses, each more exquisite than the last. But something had broken in him that night, a crack in the perfect facade. He had been drinking, yes, but not enough to justify what followed. During the peak of service, with every table occupied and all eyes watching the legendary Arthur Wright, he deliberately over-reduced the wild boar sauce. He knew exactly what he was doing as he watched the syrup thicken into bitterness. When his sous chef tasted it and paled, Arthur dismissed him with a gesture. "It's meant to be challenging," he declared, his voice cutting through the kitchen's rhythm. Then came the dessert, his signature chocolate sphere that melted when hot caramel was poured over it. Except that night, he had replaced the sugar with salt and the caramel. The first spoonfuls from diners created a wave of shocked expressions, then silent anger. But the true moment of destruction came when a young food blogger, her first time at a 3-star establishment, requested a modification due to an allergy. In his state of self-loathing, Arthur saw not a concerned diner, but another person making demands on his art. "Tell her chefs don't modify masterpieces," he said loudly enough for the entire dining room to hear. The silence that followed was more devastating than any negative review. He watched the young woman's face fall apart, her night ruined, and in that moment, he saw himself clearly, not as an artist, but as a man who had allowed excellence to become cruelty. He walked out during peak service, just dropped his knives, removed his apron, and walked through the dining room without a word. The next morning, the story was everywhere, but no one reported the truth, that his fall wasn't an accident, but a calculated implosion. Now, in Eleanor's kitchen, he washed pots and wondered if he would ever atone for the person he had become, and worse, if she would discover that the fire that destroyed his first restaurant wasn't a coincidence, but part of his downward spiral. He curled up in the dark corner of the storage room, the smell of caramelized onions still on his clothes like a ghost of who he had been, and for the first time in years, he didn't crave a bottle. He wished he'd had the courage to ask forgiveness from that young woman whose night he had ruined. As the night deepened, Eleanor was in her apartment above the restaurant, looking at old photos of Luminous, and one question haunted her: why had he chosen her restaurant, of all places? The answer, when it came, would shake everything she thought she knew about redemption. The next morning, the kitchen smelled of fresh coffee and unspoken tension. Arthur appeared at 5, as agreed, finding Eleanor already at the stove, testing a new sauce. She didn't turn when he entered, but her shoulders tightened slightly. "There are potatoes to peel," she said to the flames. "The bag is in the corner." He nodded, though she couldn't see, and went to the secondary counter where they prepped basic ingredients. The potatoes, heavy, earthy russets, waited in a net bag. His hands, still marked by morning tremors, picked up the first one. Eleanor watched through the reflection in polished pans, saw his fingers find the peeler like old acquaintances. The movement was simple, efficient, a continuous rotation that left the skin falling in a perfect spiral. Nothing special, except for the absolute economy of gesture, every muscle working without apparent effort. She approached silently while he worked. 20 potatoes later, the pile of skins formed a hypnotic pattern on the counter. "You never lose the movement," she commented, her voice neutral. He stopped, the knife hovering over the 21st potato. "Some things enter the marrow. Like riding a bicycle. Like breathing," he corrected softly. Lunch service began, and with it came the familiar rhythm both knew on a cellular level. Arthur remained in the prep area, cutting vegetables, chopping herbs, performing basic tasks any intern could do. But every cut was precise, every julienne perfectly uniform. It was during the lunch rush pressure that it happened. One of the saucepans started sticking to the bottom. The sous chef shouted for help while handling 3 simultaneous orders. Without thinking, Arthur moved. His hands, the same ones peeling potatoes minutes earlier, grabbed the pan by its handle, executing a precise circular motion that redistributed the contents without splashing. With his other hand, he took a wooden spoon, scraping the bottom with a touch that was almost a caress. "Heat too high for a port wine reduction," he murmured, adjusting the burner with his elbow. "The sugar burns before the alcohol evaporates." Every movement was fluid, instinctive, born of thousands of hours in high-end kitchens. And then he realized what he'd done. Silence fell over the kitchen. Everyone stopped to look. The sous chef's mouth hung open. The interns exchanged incredulous glances. Eleanor watched from the doorway, her arms crossed. Her eyes showed no surprise, only confirmation. "Finish the potatoes, Arthur," she said, her voice soft but loaded, "and then come to my office." He placed the wooden spoon on the counter, his hands trembling again, not from withdrawal now, but from the involuntary exposure of his true nature. The mask of the dishwasher had slipped, and behind it was the ghost of the chef who had never truly left. As he peeled the last potato, a customer in the dining room, a man in an expensive suit watching the open kitchen, frowned, his eyes fixed on Arthur's hands. Something in that movement, in the posture, in the way he held the knife, awakened a distant memory. The man picked up his phone, typing something quickly before returning to his meal. The danger, Arthur realized with a chill down his spine, was never just in the past you knew, but in the eyes that could recognize you when you least expected it. Eleanor's office was small, smelling of old papers and fresh basil. She closed the door, the click of the lock sounding like a sentence. Arthur remained standing before the desk, his hands, still smelling of potato and earth, hanging inert at his sides. "Sit," she said, not as an invitation, but as instruction. He obeyed, his aching bones protesting against the wooden chair. His eyes avoided hers, fixing instead on the photograph on the wall, a seaside restaurant, its doors burned, the skeletons of carbonized tables under a gray sky. She followed his gaze. "My first place, in Portland, burned to the ground 5 years ago." A tremor ran through Arthur's hands. He hid them in his lap. "Interesting coincidence," Eleanor continued, opening a drawer. "The fire happened the same week you disappeared from Luminous." She spread newspaper clippings across the desk, images of Luminous in its glory days, photos of Arthur receiving the 3 stars, and then headlines about his public collapse, his disappearance, the silence that followed. "Why my restaurant, Arthur?" He raised his eyes. Finally, the pain in them was so palpable Eleanor almost recoiled. "I didn't know it was yours," he whispered. "I swear, I just walked, ended up here, smelled your food from the street and remembered what it was like to hunger for something beyond oblivion." Outside in the dining room, the man in the suit, James Rutherford, retired food critic, watched the commotion in the kitchen with growing excitement. There was something about that dishwasher, something he'd swear under oath was. He pulled out his phone, browsing old photos, luminous, 7 years ago, Arthur right at his peak, his hands holding a chef's knife like a cellist holds his bow, the same hands he'd seen peeling potatoes minutes before. Meanwhile, in the office, Eleanor pushed one final photo across the table, a selfie of her, younger, in front of the seaside restaurant, the same one in the wall photo, with Arthur in the background, blurred but unmistakable. "You were there," she said, 2 weeks before the fire, came to dine alone, complained about the béarnaise sauce. Arthur looked at the photo, his breath catching. The memory returned like a tide, him, drunk and disdainful, criticizing every dish, leaving an insulting tip. The shame burned his face. "I was a different person." "No," Eleanor corrected softly. "You were the same person, just more honest about your pain." James Rutherford was now typing frantically on his phone. He'd found it, an old newspaper article showing Arthur being led by police after a bar incident, his hands bandaged, his eyes empty, the same hands, the same posture. He looked toward the office door, then toward the exit. A story like this could relaunch his career, restore his relevance. Inside the office, Eleanor closed the clippings. "You can stay, but not as a dishwasher." Arthur looked at her, confused. "There's an employee bathroom that needs deep cleaning," she said, her eyes serious. "The plumbing's been clogged for weeks. I think your hands remember how to unclog more than pots." She was giving him a chance, in a way that preserved what remained of his pride, while testing his humility. When they exited the office, James Rutherford approached, his phone discreetly recording. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, his eyes fixed on Arthur, "but aren't you the new maintenance assistant?" Eleanor interrupted smoothly but firmly. "Yes. Is something wrong with your dish, Mr. Rutherford?" The critic hesitated, surprised she knew his name. No, just, he looks like someone I knew." Arthur kept his head down, his trembling hands hidden behind his back. The past had caught up with him, and now everything depended on a woman who had every reason to expose him, but who, for some reason, chose to protect him. As James Rutherford returned to his table, confused but determined, Eleanor whispered to Arthur, "The pantry needs organizing. Perhaps you'll find something there that explains why I remember a man who believed pain was the only seasoning that mattered." She turned and went back to the kitchen, leaving him alone with the ghost of his own questions. What else did she know? And why did she keep his secrets like someone saving seeds for winter? The pantry was darker than Arthur expected, smelling of flour, dried spices, and the soft mold of an infrequently visited place. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and for the first time since arriving, he was completely alone with the silence and his own memories. Eleanor had told him to organize, but the shelves were already impeccable, labeled cans, hermetically sealed bags, spices aligned in order of use. There was nothing to organize, unless... His eyes adjusted to the gloom. In the back, behind rice bags, a worn wooden box. He pulled it into the faint light from a small high window. It wasn't locked. Inside, there were no ingredients, there were memories. Yellowed newspaper clippings, the fire at Eleanor's seaside restaurant, photos of Luminous in its prime, and a journal. The cover was simple leather, but when he opened it, his breath caught. It was Eleanor's journal, and on the first pages, she had written about him. Arthur Wright today said my béarnaise was mediocre, that I cooked afraid of pain. He was drunk, arrogant, cruel, but he was also right. Arthur turned the pages with trembling fingers. She detailed every criticism he'd thrown that night, not with anger, but like a student noting a master's lessons. She described how she'd reformulated her dishes, rethought her techniques. And then, the entry that made his blood run cold. Heard today that Luminous closed. The same flames that consumed my own kitchen seem to have consumed him too. I feel no satisfaction. I feel a strange recognition. The pain he carried was greater than what he inflicted. I hope one day he finds a place where he can just be a cook, not a legend. He fell to his knees on the cold pantry floor. She knew, she had always known who he was, and instead of exposing him, taking revenge, or exploiting him, she had brought him inside, offered him bread, given him humble tasks. She wasn't testing his humility, she was offering him a kind of silent communion. The pantry door opened. Eleanor stood in the frame, her silhouette caught by the kitchen light. "Find what you were looking for?" He couldn't speak, held the journal, his dirty hands marking the clean pages. "Why?" was all he managed to whisper. She entered and closed the door, enclosing them in that intimate, stuffy space. "Because one day," she said, her voice soft but firm, "a man told me I cooked afraid of pain, and he was right. I was afraid of failing, afraid of fire, afraid of ending up like him." "Like me," Arthur completed, the truth weighing like stone. No, she knelt to be at his level, like someone who preferred to burn everything rather than keep pretending, and I realized that for me to stop being afraid, I needed to understand what would make a man like you self-immolate. She took the journal from his trembling hands and placed it back in the box. "Now you know my secret. I didn't bring you here out of charity. I brought you because you're the only person who can teach me not to be afraid anymore." He looked at her, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time, saw the strength there, yes, but also the vulnerability. She wasn't his savior, she was his journey companion. "The clogged bathroom," he said, his voice regaining a thread of firmness. "I can fix it." She nodded, a small, rare smile touching her lips. "The plumbing is just the beginning." When they emerged from the pantry, the kitchen was empty, lunch service over. But James Rutherford, the critic, waited outside, his phone still in hand. He saw Arthur and Eleanor coming out of the pantry together, and something in their posture, in the unspoken intimacy, ignited new interest in his eyes. He was no longer looking at a story about a fallen chef. He was looking at something much more interesting, a story about two broken people finding a way to rebuild each other, and he decided it was worth waiting to see how this story would unfold. As Arthur gathered tools for the plumbing, his hands no longer trembled. The humiliation he'd felt had transformed into something different, something resembling purpose. He was no longer hiding. He was, for the first time in years, preparing to build something new from the rubble. The following weeks transformed the kitchen into a sanctuary of understood silences. Arthur no longer washed dishes, he fixed things, the bathroom plumbing, the refrigerator making strange noises, the oven door that wouldn't close properly. His hands, which once trembled from withdrawal, now found solidity in the familiar texture of tools. Eleanor watched as he worked, noticing how he solved mechanical problems with the same intuition he'd once used to create extraordinary dishes. It was the same mind, just applied to a different canvas. One afternoon, as he adjusted the exhaust fan, she approached with 2 cups of tea. "I need your opinion," she said, handing him a cup, a new dish. He froze, the wrench still in his hand. I'm no longer a chef." "I'm not asking a chef, I'm asking a man who understands flavors." She led him to the counter where she was preparing a new recipe, a lamb stew with pomegranate and spices. He tasted it, his eyes closing instinctively. Gustatory memory was stronger than any photograph. "It's good," he said. "Liar," she replied softly. "What's missing?" He took a deep breath. "Courage. You're trying to please everyone. It lacks the edges. What makes people remember?" "Show me." He hesitated, looking at the pots as if they were weapons. Then, with hesitant movements, he picked up a knife, not the chef's, just a common vegetable knife. He cut an onion into imperfect cubes, his hands still uncertain. "The problem," he said as he worked, "is that you're cooking to be loved. Food needs conflict, sweet and sour, soft and crunchy, like life." He added vinegar where she'd used wine, pepper where she'd put sugar. He transformed the polished dish into something wilder, more truthful. When she tasted it again, her eyes lit up. This is what was missing. As they remade the dish together, James Rutherford watched from the table near the window. He came every day now, always at the same time, always ordering the daily special. But his interest was clearly not gastronomic. He studied Arthur and Eleanor like an anthropologist studying tribal rituals. That night, as they closed the restaurant, Eleanor broke the silence. "He knows who you are." Arthur nodded, wiping the counter with a cloth. "Yes." "And you're not afraid?" "I am," he admitted, "but I'm more afraid of going back to who I was." It rained that night, a soft rain that washed the streets and calmed the city. Arthur slept in the small room Eleanor had arranged for him above the laundry. For the first time in years, he didn't dream of fire. In the morning, he came down and found Eleanor at the stove, testing a variation of the stew they'd created together. She looked at him, and something in her eyes made him stop. "What happened?" She pointed to the table, where an envelope lay like a threat. Inside, a single photo, Eleanor's charred restaurant, with a date written on the back, the date of the fire. "This was on the door this morning," she said, her voice controlled but tense. Arthur picked up the photo, his hands steady. "Rutherford. Why would he do this?" "Because some men prefer to watch others burn rather than admit they also carry matches." He studied the image, his mind working on a problem that wasn't culinary. Then, something caught his attention, a detail he'd never noticed before. In the photo, among the debris, there was a broken bottle, a bottle of an expensive liqueur that was only served in one place, luminous. His memory triggered like a film in slow motion. He remembered that night, not the fire at Eleanor's restaurant, but a conversation in a bar. Weeks before, a man had bought him drinks, asking questions about his downfall, the same man who now sat in their restaurant every day. "He was there," Arthur whispered, the truth hitting him like a shock. "The night your restaurant burned. He found me in a bar, asked questions about fire." Eleanor's eyes widened. You think? I don't know, but I'll find out. As the first customer of the day entered the restaurant, Arthur took his coat. His hands didn't tremble. His eyes didn't avoid hers. For the first time since arriving, he wasn't running from a ghost. He was going to confront it. He stepped out into the wet street, the photo in his hand, determined to discover how many fires James Rutherford had witnessed, and how many he himself had ignited. Eleanor watched him go, part of her fearing what he would discover, another part proud of the man he was becoming. She picked up the knife he'd used the night before and continued cutting vegetables, every movement an act of faith in the process of rebuilding, not just dishes, but lives. The fine rain covered the streets when Arthur found James Rutherford in front of the old luminous building. The critics seemed to have expected him, his hands tucked in the pockets of a coat too expensive for that decaying neighborhood. I knew you'd come, Rutherford said, his smile containing more triumph than surprise. You all always return to the ashes. Arthur maintained his posture, the photo of the burned restaurant still in his hand. Why? Because stories need endings, right? And yours, well, your disgrace was far more interesting than your glory. They entered the abandoned luminous. The place smelled of dust and abandonment, but on the walls there were still echoes of applause and expensive wine bottles. Rutherford walked to the center of the empty dining room, his voice echoing in the void. I was there that night, you know? When you destroyed your own legacy. It was the most honest thing I've ever seen you do. Arthur tasted the bitterness of memory. And Eleanor's restaurant? Ah, that. Rutherford laughed softly. Tragic coincidence, but convenient. Just like the fire at high tide 6 months before, and at Essential Flavor a year later. Places where talented chefs needed a little push to set aside their pride. The truth hit Arthur like a punch to the gut. He wasn't looking at a critic, but at a career pyromaniac. You don't understand, right? Rutherford continued, his voice taking an almost confessional tone. The culinary world is much more interesting when gods fall, and I help with that fall. Back at the restaurant, Eleanor prepared dinner with fierce determination. Her movements were precise, but her eyes often turned to the door, waiting for Arthur. The kitchen staff worked in unusual silence, sensing the tension in the air. When Arthur finally returned, his expression said everything. He went straight to the kitchen, grabbed an apron, and began cutting vegetables beside Eleanor. He confessed? She asked quietly. Enough, Arthur replied, his hands moving with renewed precision. But some battles aren't won with confrontations, they're won with legacy. That night, they cooked together for the first time, not as master and apprentice, nor as chef and assistant, but as two rivers finally finding the same course. Every dish that left the kitchen carried not just flavors, but stories of loss, of redemption, of rebuilt lives. The climactic moment came when Rutherford entered the restaurant, expecting to find Arthur destroyed. Instead, he found a transformed man, serving food that spoke of healing, not pain. Arthur approached his table, placing before him a simple dish, homemade bread, olive oil, and a sauce made from the same ingredients Eleanor had used on his first day there. Sometimes, Arthur said, his voice calm but loaded, the first step forward comes from recognizing we've already been on the ground. Rutherford tasted the bread, and something in his rigid face finally broke. He wasn't seeing a fallen man, but a man who had found something more valuable than glory. He had found his purpose. When the critic left, he left behind not a review, but an envelope. Inside were all the photos, all the evidence he'd collected about Arthur, now torn into small pieces. That night, as they closed the restaurant, Arthur and Eleanor remained in the silent kitchen. The past was still there, in the dark corners, in the memories that would never completely fade, but it no longer controlled them. "The banquet of broken vessels," Eleanor whispered, looking at the clean pots and stored knives, "because it's in our cracks that the light enters." Arthur nodded, his hands, once instruments of destruction, now steady in their purpose. They weren't cooking to erase the past, but to transform it into something that could nourish the future. Autumn arrived softly on the small town streets, bringing golden leaves that danced before Humble Kitchen, the new name that now adorned the restaurant's facade. Inside, the scent was no longer just of food, but of intertwined stories. Arthur stood before a counter where a young man named Leo watched with attentive eyes. 20 years old, hands still uncertain, but with a genuine hunger in his eyes that Arthur recognized deeply. "The secret," Arthur said while guiding the young man's hands in cutting an onion, "isn't in perfection, it's in intention." Eleanor watched from the doorway, a gentle smile on her lips. The institute they'd founded, a program for chefs in recovery, flourished in its simple forms. There were no stars or golden suns here, just broken people learning to rebuild themselves through the most basic act, feeding one another. That morning, as they prepared lunch, a woman entered the restaurant. It was the food blogger Arthur had humiliated years ago at Luminous. She paused in the entrance, her eyes scanning the simple yet welcoming space. Arthur froze, a knife still in his hand. Eleanor moved to stand beside him, her gentle touch on his arm a silent reminder that he was no longer the same man. I read about what you're doing here," the woman said, her voice more curious than angry. "I came to see for myself." Arthur took a deep breath and approached. "I was a different person that night, and I wish I could change that." She studied his face, then looked around the restaurant, watching Leo and the other apprentices working together. "It seems you already have." Instead of a critique, she spent the afternoon noting down simple recipes that Arthur and Eleanor taught, dishes that spoke of second chances, forgiveness, transformation. When she left behind not judgment, but an invitation to share their story on her platforms. That night, as they closed the restaurant, Arthur took the chef's knife Eleanor had kept all those years, the same one he'd used at Luminous. His hands, now marked by both triumphs and failures, held it with silent reverence. He turned to Leo, who was cleaning the last counter. "Come here." The young man approached, his eyes widening when Arthur extended the knife. "Tools aren't trophies," Arthur said softly. "They're promises, promises that we'll use our hands to build, not to destroy." He placed the knife in the young man's hands, closing his fingers around the handle. "The kitchen doesn't need more stars, it needs more souls." As Leo held the knife with a mixture of terror and awe, Eleanor approached and took Arthur's hand. Their fingers intertwined naturally, like two plants that had grown together through cracks in concrete. Outside, through the window, one could see them, not as legendary chefs or restaurant owners, but as gardeners patiently cultivating seeds in soil they once considered sterile. The true legacy, Arthur realized as he watched Leo show a new apprentice how to hold a knife, was never in the monuments we build for ourselves. It was in the seeds we plant in others, seeds that would continue to grow long after our own hands had rested. He turned to Eleanor, his words whispered like a prayer. "Our cracks aren't flaws, they're the veins through which light flows." And in that humble kitchen, full of broken people becoming whole again through the simple act of serving, the light truly flowed, not as a bright spotlight, but as the gentle dawn ray that announces a new day.